morning, Warsaw. Today is Thursday, 31st August. It will be mostly cloudy all day with highs of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 6:01 a.m. and sunset at 7:43 p.m. We are on the 31st day of the Warsaw Uprising and a lot is happening, including severe evacuations and more deportations of civilians. But what else is happening, Alina?
Yeah, there's a lot happening today, especially with evacuations. We have the loss of another battalion headquarters, this time near Simon's Passage, where 120 Home Army soldiers and many civilians killed in that bombing. A bomb falls straight onto the headquarters of the Hrobra battalion, and also bombs fall on the primary school, which is directly next door to this battalion headquarters. The whole building collapses. Inside are also wounded, medical teams, so doctors and nurses inside the basement, and everybody is killed when the building collapses. We have Miron Białaszewski, his diary, that remembers this specific day and this specific massacre.
On the 31st August, we learned that the 200 members of the Hrobra battalion had returned from an action to the basement in Simon's Passage. They were exhausted and quickly collapsed onto their camp beds and bunks, pulling back the blankets to lie down. Only 4 or 5 survived. They had no idea what had happened, only that they had survived bombings, which caused the basement to collapse.
The Germans keep attacking the old town again. This is a repeated thing over the past couple of days. They're supported by artillery and, of course, the Luftwaffe. They're striking every hour on the hour. The other absolutely horrific event to do with the bombing is St. Kazimierz Church in the old town, which is the northern part. The building has been rebuilt. You can go and see it. It's a beautiful little church in part of the old square. And during the bombings, bombs pierced the cellar vaults, and cellar vaults then collapsed. There were over 1,000 civilians who were hiding, seeking shelter from the bombings, including 35 nuns and 4 priests. I love that church, and I do sometimes take groups up there. It is a very small church, and a couple of months ago, a friend and I went down there, and during Mass, the nuns were singing this absolutely beautiful aria, and the size of this church just makes the acoustics just so beautiful. And standing there, knowing that over 1,000 people in the matter of seconds were killed just because of the German bombing is absolutely heartbreaking. And there were no survivors, absolutely no survivors. There were also attempts to connect Śródmieście, so the Midtown North part, and the Old Town. The attempt begins at 4 a.m, but only one part of Zoshka Company actually managed to try and get through. They hide halfway along the planned route to break through. And at the same time, a breakout was supposed to be attempted from the Old Town. So they were supposed to meet in the middle. This unfortunately fails due to poor reconnaissance, and it was very difficult to synchronise such a breakout and a breakthrough. So the attempt fails miserably. Then also in Śródmieście, again, we have sewer evacuations. One of the units were supposed to be passing through the sewers from Krasiński Square, and I usually stop my tours there in Krasiński Square, so we know exactly where they would enter the sewers, and they were supposed to end up on Bankowy Square. They also end up with heavy losses. This is something we're going to be seeing quite a lot over the next couple of weeks with the sewer evacuations. They are very dangerous. Also, the insurgents a couple of days ago managed to capture the police barracks. And also another good thing for the insurgents, a positive, is that the Germans were driven out of Halimirowskie. We haven't really talked about it, or I haven't really talked about it. Halimirowskie in the early part of the Warsaw Uprising was a place where they would execute a lot of people. Right now it is used as like a food hall, and you can go and buy flowers there. It's a little bit upmarket, but it's still a very interesting place to go. You have obviously commemorations and plaques there telling you that there were lots of executions during the Warsaw Uprising, so still a worth to go and see. Just keep your eyes peeled for the plaques. They're out on the front, where you'll be able to lay some flowers and maybe light a candle. The district of Mokotów, well, of course, that's still being bombed. There are attacks on the Sadyba district, as well as they're being attacked from the direction of Wilanów, which is in the southeastern part, but the insurgents at the moment are managing to repel those attacks. The Germans are not just concentrating their artillery and Luftwaffe on the old town, they're also now concentrating on the district of Sadyba and Czerniaków. A bomb falls on the fort of Czerniaków, where 60 insurgents are killed under the rubble alongside their commander, and the bombing just continues through the night. This is something that we're going to be coming back to a lot over the next 30 odd days, where we will have continuous bombings and whole platoons, parts of units being completely and utterly gone with one press of a button. So coming back to these civilians from the old town, Claire, what is happening here? Because we haven't talked about Prushkov very much over the past couple of days, but people are still being deported, aren't they?
Yes, well, we're 4 weeks into the uprising now. I think every party is astounded. The Germans hadn't anticipated to have this level of organisation or determination or supply. The Poles themselves had thought that it would be over in a couple of days, but were prepared to hold out for 2 weeks. Now they've had to double that. We're a month in, and it's been really taking its toll on the civilian population as well. And it's now on and throughout September that the Germans start to move the civilians that they captured out from Warsaw, from the Old Town in particular, to Pruszków, which is a small town on. It's connected by rail just outside Warsaw. And from the Pruszków camp, which was set up in an area where old rolling stock used to be made. From there, the civilians and some captured insurgents are deported to Stutów camp. So by today, by the end of August, 3,100 civilians and fighting prisoners of war as well are deported to Stutów through Pruszków. So the Stutów camp, that was set up right at the start of the war in September 1939 in this area of, quite secluded area of marshy woodland just east of Gdansk. And the Germans repurposed existing First World War structures that had originally held Polish leaders and members of the intelligentsia. It didn't get its camp status until January 1942, and it became a massive complex. Eventually, Stutów had around 40 sub-camps. And I mean, it hardly needs saying that conditions were extremely hard there, of course. There were ongoing epidemics, typhus, and in the winter of 1944, that was the coldest winter on record as well. So we're moving towards that now. It's the end of August. We're moving into September. Conditions are deteriorating in every way. The people sent there were used, of course, for forced labour. Everything was used. Every resource as possible was put towards the German military machine. So a lot of this forced labour was used at the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory. And that, as people are worked to death, it was essentially slave labour. They are replaced by more and more people being moved out. And I think those numbers really surged in this summer as the evacuations from the city of the civilians were sent in to reinforce the workforce. So yes, mass movement of civilians out of Warsaw to be reused in the German war effort as far as they could be made to. But for those still fighting in Warsaw, the situation remained appalling as well. And one of the things that really strikes me when we're recording this, I'm privileged to record with Alina and with Roger, and they both bring something very different. We all bring something different to this pod, I hope. And part of what Alina brings is not just her incredible wealth of knowledge about the Second World War in Poland, but personal experience. There's barely a family in Poland that doesn't have stories of aunts, uncles, grandfathers, grandmothers who served in different ways. And I know that it was this day, wasn't it, the last day of August, Alina, that your grandfather's closest friend was killed by a sniper. Can you tell us a bit of his story?
Yes, the person I'm referring to as my grandfather's best friend is Józef Trzeciński, also codename Nałęcz. And these two were a friendship we could never really understand. They went through unimaginable things together through the German occupation. I'm not sure how they met. I really don't know. Maybe I think it's to do that they were put together in the same platoon and they became thick as thieves. They learnt how to shoot together, how to be soldiers together. And the platoon leader I spoke about on the 24th, Rafał Olbromski, or Jan Poturicki, his real name, he is the one who trained them together. Also, I met someone who trained my grandfather, who most likely trained Józef Trzeciński as well, quite a few years ago, and he told me how they used to train. My grandfather also describes how they used to go into a factory, an old burnt out factory, and what they used to do is turn on the big generators so that would mask the sound of them shooting. So they learned to shoot all different types of weapons, from automatic machine guns to handguns to all sorts of things, to be able to learn how to be soldiers. I mean, they were part of an elite platoon. they carried out dangerous missions during the occupation. It was crazy. My grandfather also writes about when they liquidated a Gestapo agent together. So some of the most craziest things you could think of that went during the occupation, they took part in all of these things. So when the uprising began, of course, they stayed in the same platoon, which eventually became the assault platoon Rafałki after their platoon leader. One of the first missions during the uprising, they went out to take out a German gun, which was in a school next to the sanitation department. And they were known then as the Bren Squad, and they received the order to move out to deal with the problem. They had a guide that took them to the school, and their fellow platoon leader Teddy, codename, went in first, and he was shown where the Spandau was on the first floor. That was the type of gun they were using. At first they couldn't see any Germans, and I'm going to read my grandfather's testimony for this because I think it's a little bit more powerful that I read it. So, quote, "We went in very quietly. Leszek had his Bren gun ready to shoot. He took the right-hand side position next to a stack of wood, Teddy on the left, and then Nawant sat on the ground, and I leaned back into his legs. I placed my light machine gun on the tip of the stack of wood, leaning against Nawant's legs. I took aim with the Bren gun and waited. I had a great line of sight covering the Spandau. A few moments later, the head of a German appeared in the helmet next to the Spandau, and then another Kraut took his place. Teddy took my binoculars and assessed the situation. He told me that when he raises his hand, I should be ready, because when he lowers it, I should shoot the Krauts. A few more minutes passed, and the Krauts must have heard something as they began to fire the machine gun. In the meantime, Teddy had his hand in the air. Suddenly he yelled, 'Złomicz, shoot!' I fired a series of shots at the Spandau, and the gun dropped. The Kraut disappeared from the window. I fired another series of shots, and then there was silence. Suddenly in front of me, a German jumped out and began to run in the direction of the gate, so I gave him a taste of his own medicine. Now the shooting starts for real. It appeared that the Krauts were on our side of the hedge. I sent out a burst of shots towards the hedge and the gate. There were a few who had taken cover. At the same time, I don't remember exactly who, but one of the officers shouted to me, 'Stop shooting, waste of ammo.' I felt like I'd got carried away. It was the first time I could pay them back for all the harm done to us during the occupation. The following day, the priest confirmed that we'd killed many Krauts. I was fully satisfied that I had fulfilled my duty as a soldier." The reason I specifically read this out was because I wanted to show you all how close my grandfather and Nawant truly were. They took part in all their missions together. If it was during the occupation, if it was during the Warsaw Uprising, they were thick as thieves, hand in hand. And then it came down to this day. And my grandfather, already a few days earlier, had lost Jan Potolicki. Even though he was their platoon commander, he was still close to his men. And my grandfather considered him not only as his commander, but also as one of his bestest friends. And now the second loss, and I'm not putting down, of course, there were whole families that were lost in this. This is only my grandfather's personal experiences, that he loses one best friend and then he loses another. So what had happened to Nawant? Well, Nawant was killed by a sniper on ulica Czerwonego Krzyża, which is in the Powiśle district. He was leaving the hospital and he was crossing near the bridge, and that's where he got killed by a sniper. My grandfather never truly admitted this to me, so this is going to be a little bit of a rumour here. You know what it's like when it comes down to various different stories, and quite a few different people told me that my grandfather was the one who took out this sniper. I don't know if it's true, you know what it's like with legends and whatnot. But a few years back, this is before we had easy access to various different cemetery records online, I went to the museum looking for Nawant's grave. This is still when my grandfather was alive. And I went to the museum and they had the wrong details of where he was buried. And then there was a note right at the bottom of the page that said Brudno Cemetery. And that was it. That's all I had to go on. So I went to Brudno Cemetery. I had a rough idea where he possibly could be buried. And I think I spent most of the day there looking for his grave. And when I did, I picked up the phone. I rang my grandmother. I asked her to put my grandfather on the phone. And I told him that right at this very moment, I am standing at his best friend's grave, and that I promise I will never forget him. And this podcast has allowed me to immortalise this incredible human being, that he will never be forgotten to this day. I laid flowers, I said a prayer, I lit a candle, and I've kept that promise to this day. Now and Józef Czerczyński will never be forgotten. And what's very interesting is that his sister, his older sister, fought also in the Warsaw Uprising in the same battalion, and her great-granddaughter got in contact with me, I think it was a few years ago, and I really hope she's listening to this podcast, because this is him. I've immortalized him in this podcast, so forever and ever, Józef Czerczyński, you will be remembered, not just by your family, but by every single person listening to this podcast. Right, that's enough of me talking in this episode. I think we need to give Roger a bit of a chance. It's been about 15 minutes and we haven't even heard his voice. Roger, tell us what's going on in the foreign press today.
So there's two articles that I think are of interest in the foreign press on this day, on the 31st of August. The first one is, of course, referencing the 1st of September, so the outbreak of war in Europe on the 1st of September 1939. The 5th anniversary of that is a day later, so this is anticipating that anniversary. And there was an article written by Churchill himself making the link, praising the bravery of the Poles in fighting and referencing how they fought all the way through the war, but making that link that what the Poles are fighting for now in Warsaw is the same thing, is the sort of the freedom and independence that they enjoyed and that they were fighting for on the 1st of September as well. So he's trying to make that sort of narrative arc, a sort of continuity of the battle, if you like, between the 1st of September 39 and the 1st of September 1944. And it's published in the Polish press, obviously in exile. So it's sort of appealing to those politicians and other individuals who are in exile. And it makes a sort of a rather, I think, too rosily optimistic prediction, because he says in his the last paragraph, he says, from the sacrifices that are being made in Warsaw at present, a new Poland will be born. Now, that's an expression of hope, I suppose, that that the Warsaw Rising will lead to a liberation of Warsaw and of Poland, essentially under the auspices of the government in exile, a free Poland, if you like. And of course, we know that wasn't to happen. So sadly, I mean, the reality was that the sacrifices in Warsaw, at least for much of the 20th century to come, was seen as a historical dead end, and to a large extent as a historical waste. So it's a sort of a note, we could say in retrospect, it's a note of false hope on Churchill's part there. But again, it's important to make that point that he was trying to link, the events of September 39 with August of 1944. And the second article is one from German newspaper in occupied Poland. Now, the Germans had been, of course, producing propaganda for Poles, for Polish consumption throughout the occupation. I mean, that was a sort of necessary conduit of at least of official messaging, but also of trying to sort of shape Polish opinion. And this was an article from the Nowy Kurier Warszawski, so New Warsaw Courier, as the newspaper was called. And in that article, you can see the Germans trying to widen that gulf that is opening up between the allies, Poland's allies, between the British on the one side and the Americans and the Soviets on the other. And the article says, Moscow does not trust the insurgents. I mean, that much was obvious. Quote, Moscow deliberately leaves the Warsaw insurgents to their fate in order to save itself the trouble of eliminating several 100,000 Poles remaining under London's orders. The action of Great Britain, it says, which shrugs its shoulders pitifully and no longer cares about its obligation to help the Poles, is highly characteristic. England has thus betrayed Poland once again. Now, I would stress this is, of course, German propaganda for the consumption of the Polish domestic market, if you like. But when you think about the messaging in there, there's actually not much there that you can take issue with.
Almost spot on. Where it says Poles, the Poles remaining under London's orders. Well, of course, the Polish government in exile is in London. So that sort of implies that the English or the British are doing the Poles bad, but actually they're talking about the British who are hosting the Polish government in exile, and they are under their own orders to rise up. I mean, the insurgency wasn't called by Britain. The Warsaw Uprising was called by the Poles themselves, the Polish command. So I do think it's not surprising. We're at war. Of course, it's not telling the truth entirely, but the main point is that there is a lot behind this. There is a limited amount that Britain is able to do at this point.
No, it's a newspaper produced by the occupation, under the occupation. So those that were reading it, those Poles that were reading it, knew where it came from. They were under no illusion. So it's not in that sense. It's not sort of black propaganda in that it's pretending to be something it isn't. No. This is the propaganda organ of the German occupation authorities, effectively. But the messaging is absolutely spot on. It really is. Moscow is leaving the insurgents, to their fate because it wants to, have them removed, so that they don't have to deal with them. And at the same time, Britain, to a large extent, I mean, I would say that's the only bit that's slightly exaggerated, but Britain is shrugging its shoulders and can't do much to help the Poles. And it is betraying Poland again. So in a sense, this messaging, German propaganda though it is, but it's spot on.
Some wise words from Roger there right at the end of our podcast. Remember, if you haven't liked us, do like us. We need those reviews. But on something more serious, I have decided to team up with the Warsaw Uprising Museum, and we're going to be answering some of your questions in a very interesting way. So if you have questions, up until now, we've hit 31 days, so we're more or less halfway through the Warsaw Uprising. Do send us a message on social media. If you can't message us on social media, then feel free to email us. The email is Warsaw Uprising Podcast 1944, all one word. Let me repeat that again. Warsaw Uprising Podcast 1944 @gmail.com. Feel free, email us. We will be doing this about halfway through next week, and I will keep reminding you all on social media, and I will also remind you here, probably tomorrow. So thank you so much, everyone. We will see you tomorrow for day 32, which will be the 1st of September.